How are you? So that was Tyler's part of the presentation. Just saying. I'm a cloud architect and educator, as Tyler said, and I pride myself in learning a new language every year. This is the first time, however, in learning the new language that I am speaking at the first conference for that language. So a couple things. I don't work for WSO2. I did not design the language. I am more like you out in the audience. So I hope my presentation will be accessible for you. And it really consists of two parts. The two parts are the work that I do. I'm an architect and an educator. So the first part is really going to be around understanding how to run unit tests in this language. Once we progress above that level, we're going to then get into some demos and a conceptual overview of how we test at an integration level. And this is why I got into this, because I'm currently building some complex microservice-based systems. It happens to be for cancer genomics. So reproducibility for research validation is really critical for me, and that's why I focused on testing. So you guys ready to get started? Now, because we're after lunch, and because this is TDD, all of my tests are going to fail by default. So those of you in the audience who are paying good attention can actually contribute to the presentation, because we need to make all these tests pass, right? Very practical. So we're going to start out with unit tests. Now, as has been discussed, in Ballerina, you have multiple entry points. You typically are going to write services, but you're also going to write business logic. So let's look at business logic tests first. So here we are in VS Code, and by the way, kudos to the team. Very good tooling here. So we have VS Code, we have the integration with Ballerina, and I'm using their current release, so 9.8 or whatever it is. So you can see that we have our function, and it's just getting, hello world. You have to do hello world in lines 5 through 8. Now, just to make it easy, what I did is I wrote the test in the same file. As we progress through this talk, I will separate the test into a different file, and we'll get into the concept of packages. But just to get started, we'll do it this way. So this test is going to fail. And so we're going to run this test by writing Ballerina test. And it failed. Now, who's got good eyes? Which line do I need to fix to make this test pass? Line. Which line? 14. So right above 14, I've got strings that don't match. Do you see it? So let me go ahead and rerun this. And we have our first passing test. So good job. So a couple things that I want to call out here. You can see in line 3, we're importing the test package. And then in line 10, we're using the @test config to run this test. And then in line 14, we're just calling our assert. Now, in addition to our actual and our expected, we have a message, which is always valuable in testing. So that's the basics of testing. So, unlike some of the other languages, if you have multiple tests in a file, then you're going to make use of this config. So you can see in this example, I have how many tests? 1, 2, 3, right? So you can see that the config has an attribute called enable for 2 of the 3 tests. The test that is on line 7 is set to be enabled. On line 12 is not enabled. And line 18, it's not specified. So, audience question, how many of these tests are going to run when I run the tests in this file? How many? 2. Well, if Tyler answers, it better be right. But Ballerina, let's see what the default is here. And of course, we're going to have a failing test because I said it that way. So indeed, 2 tests ran. So the default for the configuration attribute is for the test to be enabled, but you can control it with the switch. And of course, we have to get our test passing, so what line do I need to go to? I'll make this a little bit easier for you guys. Which line do I need to go to? Come on. 9. See, I'm making Tyler earn his money today.
Can you zoom in one level?
Yeah, I can. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So now the people in the back have no excuse. and now we have passing tests. All right, so in addition to enabling and disabling on the config attribute, you have a groups attribute. And you can see in the groups attribute here, we have with config G1, G1, and G2. Now when we run this particular test, we can use the group switch. And I'll just copy this to go faster. And that's going to run our tests that have the groups attribute. And this is because tests are going to have dependencies. Okay? And we need to make our test pass. So let's fix this. And we'll make our test pass. And there we have passing tests. Following along so far? Can I go faster? I can go faster. I'm teasing. So the next one here is we have guaranteed order. So again, when you're writing business logic, you might have functions that are dependent. And this is yet another option in the config where you have dependencies. So here we have test function 4 depends on 6. Test function 5 depends on 4. And as before, we just run ballerina test. And we're running 4. And we have a dependency failure here. Again, I kind of took the low road and wrote the same type of failure. And you can see my assert true has to be true. And now I can get everything to pass. All right, the last core thing in unit tests I'm going to show you is data-driven. So as has been discussed, JSON is a first-class object type here, and in the world of testing, you have a data provider. So you can see here we've got a JSON function that's expecting a certain JSON data to be returned, and we're testing against it. So if we run this, do you think it's going to pass or fail? What do you think, guys? Fail, right. Okay, and we are at 5. And it's going to fail. And you can see that the failure is on which line? 24. Nice error messages. And I fixed that because we've never ever made a case error in JSON, have we? I've never done it, have you? Kidding. And now we're passing. So I whipped pretty quickly through the unit tests because I'm thinking that a lot of you are interested at a higher level in terms of integration. But it is important that you understand how these basic configurations allow you to control the tests. So let's go down here. So we went through importing the test framework, the @ configuration, the assert equals. We looked at some of the values that you could supply to the config. We didn't do all of them. We did groups, and we're coming up on the before and after. And there are even more that we'll be looking at, and then we have the standard assertions. In terms of running your tests, I start out really simply. I put the tests actually in the same file, which you'd really only do for demonstration. Typically, you would have your business logic in a Ballerina file, and then you would have your tests in a separate file. And the expected structure is to be in a tests folder, which is underneath a top-level folder which defines the package. And you saw earlier, but I want to emphasize that you want to run the ballerina init command because that lets Ballerina understand the package structure that you have in your particular project. Now, in addition to running the ballerina test command individually, you can run it at the package level, and that is more typical. So that's what we're going to do next. And we're going to do that when we look at a service. Now, as has been discussed, Ballerina is very often used for writing services. So we'll just jump out and take a look at the service. And a couple of things. First, I just put this in because this is me, basically. I expected to use a mock, which some people will, probably boo and hiss because mocks are sometimes seen as a negative code smell. But I wanted to just show you what a mock looked like, even though we're not going to use it to test a service, because I was just curious. So I figured if I was curious, maybe you're curious. So this is a mock, and this is what it looks like, and it's going to fail. And it's interesting to me, now this is a very sort of academic mock, because you can see on line 6 we're mocking a method in the current package, which is not typically what you would do. You'd usually mock something externally. But it helps us to understand how mocks work, because you will need them for certain types of functionality. You can see you've got this int add function here, which is going to add, and then you have a mock int add, which is going to be called in the test when int add is called. So when int add is called here, instead of getting 5 plus 3, we got a failure because the mocking function is just a different function. And this is just, again, a very academic. So how should I fix this test? What should I do? Yeah, I could put a plus. Yeah, I could do that. I could put a 2 there as well. There's a number of ways, right? So there we go. So like I said, mocking is something that I think there will be some use of, but more typically when you're working with services, you're going to use not mocking, rather this pattern. So this pattern in Ballerina is that you have a function which will start your service and a function which will stop your service. So this is the classic Hello World service. And what I'm going to do first is, just because, again, I know a lot of this is new for everybody in the room, I'm just going to start the service. Just, start it normally, basically. This is the same service we've seen over and over. And if we wanted to manually test it, we would just curl the endpoint. It's over here. Great, fine. Okay, so what's good about testing? So in the world of testing, your service might not be running. So the testing pattern here is that you will start your service, run your test, and then stop your service. So if I go ahead and I run this, I say Ballerina test, and I do this. Notice I'm going to start and stop the endpoint. Very elegant, really, and very elegant, easy to use. Of course, it failed because I did my typical trick of having some annoying syntax problem here, which we'll fix. I got hello world, and it's expecting hello world. Again, all these kind of errors that we see all the time, right, in the real world, and then that will pass. So that's the general pattern. Now, what I was saying when I was introducing this section is that rather than having your test and your business logic in the same file, it's more typical that what you're going to do is separate these out into a package. And let me just clean a little bit here, and then we'll go into that. So you can see here is that same service just by itself, and then we have this structure with the package, and then we have the test. So what we do differently is now we go to the level of the package, and we go make sure we're at the right level, and then we say Ballerina test, and we don't specify a file, rather we specify the package. Does it make sense? It's actually really important, and I'll just be honest, it took me a little bit to actually grok that, and so that's why I'm emphasizing it. So of course we had a failure because I'm consistent, and so we're going to need to fix that. And so we're going to go here. And what we've done is we've done the same thing, but can you see how they're separate now? We have 2 separate files, so we're kind of building up to more of a services type of an architecture. Making sense? Okay, good. All right. So in the Ballerina world, we test services with the pattern of starting and stopping the service. But of course, we only tested a service. And that's looking at the great diagram there. So what we are really interested in doing is we're really interested in testing integration, right? So there is, these are just some of the examples we went through. There is a very nice sample on the Ballerina code sample site, and it is an aggregator. Now this happens to use 4 Ballerina services. So it uses the composition initiator, the travel agency, and then it works with 3 Ballerina services. But this pattern is one that you're going to use with both external and internal services. So it's basically having 4 endpoints rather than 1 endpoint, all Ballerina services. Now, if you look at the package model, here's the example right here, and we go into the travel agency. Let me just clean some of this up here so you guys can see better. You can see that in the travel agency test, what we have is we have a before function, and this before function doesn't call one endpoint, it calls 4 endpoints. Does that make sense? Testing service aggregation. And then the after function shuts down all 4 endpoints, okay? So now we start to see how packages work. Now inside of here, we're testing, passing in this complex JSON record. And as was said before, you see some of the language capabilities here, the arrow which points to something outside of the current system or process. So to run this, we have to get to the right level, which is guide. And let's make sure we're at the right level. And we're at guide. And let's see, so we should be at guide. So yeah, there. Okay, so we're in guide. And now, because we've got tests not only for the travel agency, but for all of the services, if we just run Ballerina test, that's going to actually test all 4 of our services. It's going to start and stop using that same pattern. This is super important. Is this making sense to everybody? This is one of the key aspects of testing, and I didn't bother making this fail because I think you kind of get the point by now. But you can see that by just running Ballerina test at the level of the package, what we've done is we've run all of the tests for all of the services in aggregation. It's really a key takeaway from what I've learned in working with Ballerina and testing. Really very important. Okay, so that's all good, but we have to deploy our stuff. And I don't know if you guys are like me in YAML hell, but I am in YAML hell right now, trying to write complex sets of YAML files for Kubernetes deployments, and it's hard. It's hard. So the capabilities to generate these files in Ballerina I find to be super useful. So, and we did that example. So at this level, what do we look at in terms of testing? And this is like really interesting to me because you want to test just enough, right? And so there's different things you can test at the level of Docker and Kubernetes. And so first I'll just kind of show you again what this looks like, and then talk about some things I've seen in this world of testing. So again, props to the team, because I think this stuff's pretty cool, I gotta say. So in Docker, I have this little example here that kind of pulls together some of the concepts that we've seen throughout the day. So this is a service, again, it's Hello World. But how it's different is we have the Docker annotation. So you can see here's the Docker annotation that you saw. And not only do we have a Docker annotation, we have something that reflects my reality, which is when you work with genomics, you have to have reproducible research, so you have to have some associated files that you publish. So in the Docker container that's going to be generated here, we can read and write from some data files and some configuration files, and you can see they're right here. Okay, so now if I build this, then I will get the ability to run this in Docker. So we're going to go Ballerina build. Oh, let's make sure we're in the right level. Yeah, Ballerina build and Docker with files. I actually think this is just cool. Come on, man, this is cool. It's really freaking cool. So I have the Docker plugin, by the way, which is awesome for VS Code. And now I can just run this, and bam, there's my Docker container, and I'm cool like that. See, there it is, right? Yeah, seriously. So one of the things that's interesting, and I have my version of these files up on GitHub, is I will not take the time, I don't have the time, but I won't take the time to do this, but this travel agency aggregate sample, I did play with this, and maybe I'll make a separate recording or something. What is super awesome about this sample is it has, check this out, like the 4 services, the 4 Ballerina services, it has both Docker and Kubernetes annotations. So it's really good for learning, because what you can do is you can run it as 4 Ballerina services, just local on your machine. Then you can run it as 4 Docker containers. Then you can run it as Docker containers in a Kubernetes cluster if you have Kubernetes on your machine. It's really, I mean, it's for me, one of the best samples for kind of getting your head around this. So really recommend using it. So speaking about that, when we're testing Docker, it's really interesting to think about what we should test. Should we test, for example, we had the hello world, that we get hello world back, the output. Should we test this, the image? Should we test the dependencies? What should we test? And because I'm a consultant, of course, I'm going to say it depends, right? The typical answer. But I really do find that. I have some customers that are using really standard containers. We don't need to test the Docker file for a standard container. But I have other situations, I've done some machine learning for bioinformatics, that I do need to test not only the output, but also the files. And I need to validate the Docker container, because that's part of the published research. It's a really interesting problem, actually, as an aside. In bioinformatics, there's one study that I read that said 75% of the published research was not reusable because it was not reproducible, because there was a lack of control over objects like these container files, which is really interesting stuff, relates to what we're talking about. So let's see if I can go here. So in addition to what's available in Ballerina, as was shown in some of the other presentations, Ballerina integrates nicely with some other tools if you have needs for higher levels of testing. A tool that I'm starting to look at, and my links will be in these slides, is Google published a container structure test tool, which meets all those needs that I just talked about. So you can do unit tests for the Docker image, you can do command tests that verify the output, file existence tests that verify the input, file contents, and metadata tests. So I'm actually going to be working with that and publishing on it, so you can just follow me on social media or whatever, and you can see how that goes. In addition, testing at the level of Kubernetes. I was at a DevOps conference last week in Minneapolis, and I went to a seminar from Sysdig, and I learned about a Kubernetes verification tool called Falco. Very interesting. Again, rules, alerts on drift. You have container and Kubernetes best practices, and it's very configurable. So this is just an area that I know I'll be working in. I'll be interested to hear from the rest of the community using Ballerina in this way. So my modified pyramid here, and hope Martin Fowler does not object, is that in the world of Ballerina and microservices, you still are going to have a lot of unit tests, and that's why I included that in this presentation. The service testing paradigm that I showed with starting and stopping, I find to be very elegant and usable, and particularly nice when combined with groups of services like I showed you with the travel agency example. At the level of Kubernetes and Docker, I'm still learning. I have to be honest with you. I'm still learning about what kind of testing is most appropriate. What's interesting is I draw this line of observability at the end-to-end level. And what that means is that it's often more usable for the solutions that I'm building to do a type of testing in production. And there's actually a talk later this afternoon about observability, and that's because more and more the number of microservices is so much that it is really impractical to test in any other location end-to-end other than production. And to that end, there are a couple other thoughts about testing the entire system. So this is from a talk, and the reference is given here, that talks about some approaches that kind of go in between on this line, basically, between development and testing in production. And they include approaches like giving your developers their own Amazon accounts so they can have mini sandbox. You can have a full stack in a box local, which is the way I do it. I have Docker installed with Kubernetes, so I can set up Kubernetes clusters locally. You can test your documentation. You can have shared testing instances and stub services. In addition to that, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the very trendy chaos. We want to inject chaos into our systems for some strange reason. The reason is it's practical. It's practical. So there's a wonderful talk that I have referenced here, and the speaker actually talks about, rather than chaos engineering, it should be engineering chaos, which may seem like a semantic picky note, but I actually agree with it. because the idea is not just to go and kick the plug out of your server and ha ha ha, let's see what happens. It's to more thoughtfully inject problems and faults into production environments and then observe the results. I was really excited to see Honeycomb here. I actually went last week to a session, an interactive session on observability with Honeycomb, and I'll be really excited to see what those folks have to say later today, because I think it is a critical part of the testing pyramid. Of course, it's San Francisco, so I have to have the trendy Twitter quote here. So from a woman, microservices are supposed to make life easier, maybe for the developer working with them, but for me as a tester, it's certainly not easier to have an overview of how they all connect and stuff. Integration is still hard. So it's hard, but things like Ballerina are making it better. So this is my view. So Martin Fowler's really going to be upset because I don't consider it a pyramid. I consider it a circle. So I think that you're going to be doing some unit tests on your functions, methods, services. You're going to do some integration tests. You're going to test interactions within groups, between groups, and outside groups. You're going to do some kind of deployment tests. You're going to test container configurations, management, configuration, and endpoints. And then you might do what I call modern tests, so like AWS own account for developers and so on. And then some of your tests are going to be in production. I think that's the reality. I think that is a key learning for me as I've been working through this. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of my enterprise customers, but that goes with the territory, I think. So I know I'm going to be paying attention in the observability talk, and you should too. So an additional resource I have for you as I'm kind of winding down here is there is a website called Exorcism.io, which some of you might be familiar with. A friend of mine, actually, Katrina Owen, is the primary originator of it, although she has a big team. And what it is failing tests, so kind of like what I started with, unit tests, that then you write the implementation code, you upload the code, and it's crowdsourced mentorship. Now, they just had a V2 launch, and part of it, they're adding human mentors, because the Exorcism team has this goal of helping people come into the world of programming languages, particularly new languages. So I'm actually super happy that the Ballerina team is committed to getting exercises up onto Exorcism and will be mentoring. So it'll be a great place if you do want to get yourself or your developers started with Ballerina language. So I'm going to do the prerequisite closing slide, and with 30 seconds left, I think I'm actually done. So thanks.
We do have a question. Someone online asked, are the tests run in random order?
In random order?
Mm-hmm.
Tyler, are the tests run in random order?
I don't believe so, unless you have the dependency.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
That's right.
Okay.
So order of the file, right?
Yep.
Samira? He's not in the room. Okay, we're going to go with that answer.
I think so. Okay.
Yeah. All right, thank you, Lynn.
Thank you very much, everyone.